It's Christmas Eve in West Dublin. Brown's Steakhouse is busy with cheerful diners amid the holiday buzz. Among them sits Jason Hennessy Sr., a man notorious in the city's underworld, enjoying a quiet meal with family. The twinkle of festive lights dances across white tablecloths. Suddenly, chaos intrudes. Two masked figures burst through the restaurant doors. Shouts echo. In an instant, gunfire erupts. Sharp cracks that send patrons diving for cover under tables adorned for Christmas. When the gunmen flee moments later, Jason Hennessy lies collapsed on the floor between overturned chairs, fatally wounded. One of the assassins is down as well, bleeding out not far from the man he came to kill. In the stunned silence that follows, the reality sets in. The Gucci gang has struck, and they have done so with trademark brazenness. This shocking hit on a gangland kingpin in a public restaurant is the culmination of a reign of terror that has tormented Dublin for years. To understand how it came to this bloody climax, we must step back and trace the rise and fall of the Gucci gang and its infamous leader, a man known on the streets as Mr. Flashy. Glen Ward never set out to become Dublin's most talked-about gangster. In fact, in his early youth, he was a promising footballer. By all accounts, he was well raised and had potential for a bright future on the pitch. But as he drifted into his late teens, the allure of easy money and flashy living in the criminal underworld proved too tempting. Older gangsters in the neighborhood noticed the confident young man and began to pull him into their orbit. One mentor in particular, Carl Hyland, a relative of a slain crime boss, introduced Glen to a world of designer clothes, expensive watches, and the status that comes with them. Glen's eyes opened wide. He loved the bling, the way it made him feel powerful and important. The nickname Mr. Flashy soon followed, a nod to his penchant for Gucci belts, designer man bags, and high-end streetwear. In the grey working-class streets of North Dublin, Glen Ward stood out, always clad in the latest fashion, driving souped-up cars, throwing cash around. It was all part of the image he cultivated, but beneath the glamorous facade, Glen was learning the trade that would fund it. By his late teens, he was deeply involved in the local drug scene, running errands and dealing on behalf of established criminals. He proved to be ambitious, shrewd, and ruthless when necessary. These traits did not go unnoticed. Around 2014, as Glen was climbing the ranks, he forged a partnership that would define his early career. He fell in with Trevor, a hardened criminal from Finglas with connections to the powerful Kinahan cartel. Byrne was older, an established enforcer with a violent reputation, exactly the sort of ally a young upstart like Glen could use. Through Byrne, Glen's dealings expanded. He was no longer just a street dealer. He was becoming an integral part of the large drug supply chain that flowed from the Kinahan cartel into Dublin's neighborhoods. The Kinahans, one of Europe's most notorious crime families, were then locked in a brutal feud with the rival Hutch gang, a feud that had already spilled an alarming amount of blood on Dublin's streets. Siding with the Kinahans gave Glen significant backing in the criminal underworld, a connection that both protected him and provided ample product, cocaine, heroin, cannabis, you name it, to push onto the streets of Finglas and beyond. In essence, Glen Ward became the Kinahan cartel's man in Finglas, running what was effectively their outpost in that part of the city. But in the underworld, fortunes shift fast. Within a couple of years, Trevor Byrne's star faded. He got into serious legal trouble, implicated in crimes including a high-profile gangland murder. With charges looming and enemies circling, Byrne fled Ireland, leaving a power vacuum in Finglas. Glen Ward, still only in his early 20s but hungry and fearless, stepped in to fill that void. Practically overnight, he became the de facto leader of a rising gang of young Finglas hoods. The media, and soon the public, would come to know this group by a nickname both absurd and fitting: the Gucci Gang, a tongue-in-cheek moniker referencing their love of designer labels. It wasn't a title Glen chose for himself, but he certainly embraced the image. Under his leadership, the Gucci Gang expanded quickly. They took control of drug dealing not just in Finglas, but pushed west, rubbing up against other criminal outfits. Glen's flair for self-promotion and intimidation meant that soon everyone knew who ran the show on the north side. Flashy cars with loud engines roaring down quiet estates at midnight, Gang members strutting in puffer jackets and Italian sportswear, gold watches dangling from wrists as they exchanged fist bumps on street corners. They were young, many still in their late teens or early 20s, and they carried themselves with the bravado of a crew that felt untouchable. That bravado was put to the test in early 2019, when a series of brutal murders announced the Gucci gang's presence to all of Dublin. It started with a dispute over something almost mundane in the drug world, an unpaid debt. A 23-year-old small-time dealer named Zach Parker had lost a shipment of cocaine, seized by the police, and therefore couldn't repay the gang for it. Parker had been working with Glenn's crew, an up-and-comer in the trade. But in the cutthroat accounting of Gangland, a loss is a loss, and someone must pay. On a cold evening in January 2019, Parker was gunned down outside a gym in Swords, shot multiple times as he sat in his car. The hit was quick and professional. Parker's passenger was wounded but survived, while Parker died at the scene slumped over the wheel. Word on the street was clear: the Gucci gang had zero tolerance for anyone who cost them money or disrespected them. And killing a young dealer who owed a relatively small sum was a way of sending an outsized message. The violence did not stop there. Parker had friends, among them another young man from the Finglas scene, 22-year-old Sean Little. Little was incensed at Parker's murder. Perhaps he made threats of revenge, or perhaps Glenn simply feared Little might retaliate someday. Either way, 4 months later, Sean Little's bullet-riddled body was found on a country road beside a burning car. It was a gruesome execution. He'd been shot in the head, and his killers set his car ablaze before melting into the night. Little's murder sent shockwaves through the community. He was known to have ties to major gangs, and his killing signaled that nobody was off limits. The very next day, as mourners and friends reeled from Little's death, another associate of his met the same fate. Jordan Davis, age 22, was pushing his baby son in a stroller along a quiet laneway in Darndale in broad daylight when a gunman approached and opened fire. Davis was killed while his infant child sat in the pram inches away. Miraculously, the baby was unharmed physically. The brazenness of murdering a young father in front of his child was horrifying, but it underscored the message: if you stood against the Gucci gang, or even might stand against them, you were marked. Within a span of a few months, 3 young men, all once part of or close to Glenn's circle, were dead. This sequence of killings became known in the media as the Culock feud, named for the area where much of the blood was shed. In truth, it was less a feud than a one-sided purge. Anyone who owed the gang, anyone who spoke of payback, was eliminated with clinical efficiency. Even an older, hardened criminal, an outsider named Hamid Sanambar, who was friendly with some of these victims, was not spared. In May 2019, mere days after attending Sean Little's wake, Sanambar was shot dead on the front steps of Little's home. As if to drive home that not even a 41-year-old with connections could step into this fight without paying the ultimate price. Dublin's underworld took notice. Mr. Flashy and his Gucci gang were lethal, unpredictable, and willing to strike at will. For Glenn Ward, this carnage had an upside. It cleared out any early challengers and solidified his reputation. By the end of 2019, he was thriving. The Gucci gang's drug business was booming, with heroin and cocaine sales lining their pockets. With rivals either scared off or 6 feet under, Flashy's crew controlled the trade across Finglas and parts of North Dublin. The Kinahan bosses were undoubtedly pleased with their young proxy. Flush with cash and confidence, Glenn sank further into his lavish lifestyle. Wild parties at rented mansions, VIP booths in city nightclubs with champagne sparklers shooting into the air, and of course, always the designer gear. On social media, some gang members showed off wads of $50 notes and designer shopping bags, an open taunt to both rivals and law enforcement. They had money, power, and the backing, yet even as Mr. Flashy reached new heights, trouble was brewing just beneath the surface. His aggressive, sometimes hot-headed behavior was making enemies beyond the ones he had already dispatched. Over in the suburb of Blanchardstown, specifically the Corduff area, an older group of criminals bristled at the encroachment of this brash young gang into their territory. Jason Hennessy Sr. was among them, an established drug boss who had run Corduff for years. Now Hennessy watched as Glenn Ward's operatives muscled in, poaching customers and alliances. A feud quietly ignited between the Gucci gang and the Corduff gang led by the Hennessys, setting the stage for future showdowns. Meanwhile, within Glenn's own ranks, tensions were quietly mounting. He ruled the Gucci gang like a personal fiefdom, with a style one associate would later describe as dictatorial. Glenn made all the decisions: who got what territory, who lived, who died, and he expected absolute loyalty and deference. For a while, his crew of mostly teenage boys and 20-somethings went along. After all, Glenn delivered the goods, literally in terms of drugs and cash. But as some of those underlings grew in experience and ego, cracks began to form. More than a few resented playing second fiddle to Mr. Flashy indefinitely. The seeds of betrayal were quietly being planted, even as the gang was at the height of its power. By 2020, Garda had zeroed in on the Gucci gang as one of the capital's most volatile crime groups. Surveillance intensified. Detectives compiled lists of known associates, watched their haunts, monitored their social media bragging. They identified at least 22 key members in Flashy's orbit, a web that included not only local Irish thugs, but even international connections, like the aforementioned Hamid Sanambar. Armed with this intelligence, law enforcement began seizing drugs and weapons linked to the gang. Raids in Finglas turned up piles of cocaine, heroin, and firearms. On one occasion, an Uzi submachine gun and a cache of ammunition were discovered in a stash house. Garda also systematically worked to dismantle the gang's operational hubs. They boarded up a few houses in Finglas that the Gucci gang had cuckooed, essentially taken over from vulnerable residents to use as drug-dealing bases. Each small victory chipped away at the gang's sense of security, but in truth Glenn and his crew remained elusive. They were careful, and community intimidation meant few locals dared to speak against them. Mr. Flashy himself transformed his home into a virtual fortress. After being targeted in a drive-by shooting, one of several attempts on his life, Glenn installed bulletproof windows and reinforced doors. CCTV cameras and snarling guard dogs completed the picture. He knew there were plenty of people who wanted him dead, and not just the police. For a while, these precautions and his own cunning kept Mr. Flashy ahead of his enemies. But fate has a way of catching up. New Year's Day 2022 arrived, and with it came an omen of the chaos that year would bring. Glenn Ward decided to kick off 2022 with a display of firepower that was as reckless as it was arrogant. At a house party in Finglas, as music pounded and revelers toasted the new year, Glenn retrieved one of the gang's prized possessions, AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, a weapon of war far beyond any firepower a street gang should have. In the backyard, he lifted the rifle, pointed it toward the night sky, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked and thundered as it spat out rounds into the air. Young gang members stood around filming on their phones, whooping in delight at their boss's audacity. Grinning, Glenn handed the rifle to his younger brother, Eric, encouraging him to take a turn. Eric, just 23 and eager to prove himself, fired off a trio of shots while the camera rolled. It was all captured in a short video clip, a celebration of their perceived invincibility. In that moment, Glenn likely felt untouchable. Here he was, literally firing an assault rifle for fun in a suburban neighborhood, and who was going to stop him? It wouldn't be long before reality answered that question. Only a few months into 2022, Mr. Flashy's tightly controlled empire began to implode from within. The trigger was a betrayal by someone Glenn had once considered a close friend and lieutenant, James Whelan. James Whelan, 29, had been part of Flashy's inner circle. The two shared history and had made plenty of money together. But as with many gangs, disputes over money and power can poison even the strongest bonds. Whelan had grown increasingly dissatisfied under Glenn's domineering leadership. He felt he deserved a larger cut, more autonomy, perhaps even to run Finglas himself. The friendship soured. Early in 2022, Whelan broke away, taking with him a faction of the younger dealers and gunmen. Essentially, he formed a splinter gang right in Flashy's backyard. Bad blood between Flashy and his former protégé was now an open secret on the streets. Tensions rose quickly, and it didn't take long for tit-for-tat attacks to begin. Cars were set on fire in driveways as warnings. Known associates on each side were jumped and beaten or stabbed. Houses of relatives were vandalized or firebombed. Ordinary residents of Finglas suddenly found themselves living in a war zone as two gangs of young men prowled the estates at night looking for targets. The local Garda station braced for an onslaught. They had seen gang feuds before, but this had the makings of an especially reckless one. Both Flashy and Whelan were volatile characters with access to plenty of firearms and a deep personal grudge between them. Neighbors whispered that it was only a matter of time before someone got killed. That prophecy came true in the early hours of April 3, 2022. James Whelan had decided to send Mr. Flashy a message of his own. Under cover of darkness, Whelan and some of his crew crept toward a house on Deanstown Avenue, a property linked closely to Flashy's gang, possibly a safe house or a friend's home. A petrol bomb was lit and hurled, exploding into flames as it hit the building. It was a brazen provocation on Whelan's part, an attempt to show that he wasn't afraid of Glen Ward. But it would be his final act. Within hours, the retaliation came. The details remain murky, but it appears Whelan was lured into an ambush not far from the site of the firebombing. Some say he was chasing a rival or investigating something when a gunman stepped from the shadows. On a dark Finglas street, James Whelan was shot dead, the first life claimed by the Finglas feud. His body was found near a front garden as news of his killing spread like wildfire through the community. Mr. Flashy's gang had struck back ruthlessly, eliminating Glen's one-time friend turned bitter enemy in short order. Whelan's murder was a turning point. It sent both shock and mistrust through the Gucci gang itself. On one hand, Glen had removed a threat, but the ease with which he ordered, or at least condoned, the execution of a former friend made others in his crew wary. If Flashy could do that to Whelan, what might he do to someone else who displeased him? Some of Glen's associates began keeping their distance or even quietly severing ties. The gang that had once been a united front now splintered into factions. Essentially, three groups emerged: those still loyal to Mr. Flashy, those aligning with remnants of Whelan's breakaway crew. Even after James was gone, a few of his allies remained active and thirsting for revenge. And a third faction of younger dealers who decided to go it alone amidst the chaos, no longer under Flashy's thumb. Glen Ward's iron grip on Finglas was loosening, and he could feel it. The immediate aftermath of Whelan's death was an eruption of mayhem. Retaliation begat retaliation. Mere days after the shooting, the home of Whelan's mother, an innocent woman who had nothing to do with gangland affairs besides being James's mother, was firebombed in the middle of the night. The front windows shattered as flames gutted the living room. Thankfully, she escaped unharmed, but the cruel message was clear. Even your family is fair game. Whelan's faction, now led by a young associate of his, hit back where they could, attacking relatives and hangouts of Flashy's gang. North Dublin descended into a tit-for-tat guerrilla war, with petrol bombs, drive-by shootings, and beatings becoming grimly commonplace. Residents of Finglas grew used to the sight of armed Garda patrols and checkpoints, as police desperately tried to prevent further bloodshed. The local parish priest at one point publicly pleaded for peace, lamenting at a funeral mass that too many young men were being led astray by the false glamour of gang life. His voice, though earnest, was drowned out by the gunfire on the streets. For Mr. Flashy, life became a paranoid nightmare. He was still nominally on top, but he was a king under siege. His routine now included wearing a bulletproof vest whenever he dared step outside. He rotated safe houses, sleeping in different beds every few nights, never letting anyone, even his closest pals, know exactly where he'd lay his head. He even had what amounted to body doubles, sometimes sending a lookalike associate driving in one of his trademark cars as a decoy, while Glen himself quietly drove another car, hoping to throw off any would-be hitmen tailing him. Despite these measures, his enemies nearly got him that summer. In June 2022, Glen and a couple of his associates were in a taxi traveling through Finglas when suddenly two vehicles boxed them in and rammed the taxi off the road. A group of armed men leapt out, guns blazing, riddling the taxi with bullets. Miraculously, almost unbelievably, Glen and his men survived by inches, scrambling away as the attackers fled. It was a very close call. Gardaí later arrested two suspects in connection with that botched assassination attempt. The word was that this was Whelan's crew, or what remained of it, striking from beyond the grave, trying to take out Mr. Flashy once and for all. The incident only deepened Glenn's paranoia. He knew that next time he might not be so lucky. Unbeknownst to Glenn Ward, that failed hit would ironically sow the seeds of his own downfall in a way he couldn't have expected. When police searched the bullet-riddled taxi after the ambush, they recovered a mobile phone left behind by one of Flashy's panicked associates. Upon examination, analysts found a video on the device, footage from the New Year's house party just a few months prior. There was Glenn on screen, grinning in the dark, firing the AR-15 into the sky, while a chorus of juvenile voices hollered in the background. The video left little to the imagination. It was clear evidence of illegal possession and discharge of a deadly weapon. Furthermore, a subsequent raid in February 2022, possibly based on intelligence that came from tracking feud-related activity, had already turned up that same AR-15 rifle and a submachine gun hidden in a Finglas property. Now the Gardaí could link those guns to Glenn directly via the video. Piece by piece, the law was building an ironclad case against Mr. Flashy that had nothing to do with trying to prove murders. Instead, it was based on firearms charges, which in Ireland's courts can carry hefty prison terms, especially when handled by the Special Criminal Court for Gangland cases. As 2022 rolled into 2023, the Gucci gang was hemorrhaging power. Dozens of its members were behind bars or had fled. Those who remained free found themselves fighting on two fronts, enduring continued skirmishes with the scattered remnants of Whelan's faction and facing a bitter feud with the Culock gang led by the Hennessy family. For a time, tit-for-tat shootings flared in Blanchardstown as well. Glenn Ward's men reportedly clashed with Hennessy's crew over drug turf, and it got ugly. In one particularly gruesome incident, a group linked to the Hennessys kidnapped a young man they suspected of betraying them. They restrained him and literally branded the word rat into his skin. The message was medieval in its savagery. This is what happens to informants. Meanwhile, on the other side, associates of Flashy were targeted in drive-by shootings around West Dublin. War on multiple fronts was stretching the gang thin. Throughout 2023, Gardaí kept up relentless pressure. They raided premises, seized more drugs and cash, and monitored every rumor of an impending hit. Arrests trickled in. Flashy's younger brother, Eric O'Driscoll, was nabbed, and in early 2023, he pleaded guilty to possessing the AR-15 rifle. The court handed Eric a 5-year prison term, a significant blow to Glenn, who not only lost his brother's help on the outside, but also likely felt a pang seeing his little brother behind bars for following his lead. Glenn himself was by now a prime target for law enforcement. He was finally arrested and charged for the assault rifle escapade and related weapons offenses. After years of seeming untouchable, Mr. Flashy was preparing to face a judge. Yet incredibly, even as the net tightened, Glenn Ward allegedly continued to orchestrate violence. He and his dwindling crew set their sights on finishing the feud with the Hennessys once and for all. Jason Hennessy Sr., the Culock boss, had thus far survived the shadow war, but the Gucci gang wanted a decisive victory to reassert their dominance. Which brings us back to that fateful Christmas Eve at Brown's Steakhouse. The hit was audacious, to say the least, assassinating a gangland figure in a public upscale restaurant on a holiday. But Glenn's crew was desperate to re-establish their fearsome image. Disguised gunmen stormed in and opened fire at Hennessy as he dined, striking him multiple times in the chest amid panicked screams from families around. Hennessy died shortly after, dealt a death blow in front of horrified onlookers. In the confusing melee, one of the attackers was also killed. Whether accidentally caught in crossfire or deliberately silenced by an accomplice, no one on the outside knows for sure. The scene was like something out of a gangster film, and it appalled the Irish public. Murders on the streets were one thing. Doing it in a crowded restaurant on Christmas Eve was a new level of ruthlessness. For the authorities, this was the final straw. The call went out at the highest levels of Ireland's police. Bring down Mr. Flashy's gang at any cost. In early 2024, a series of coordinated operations took place. The Criminal Assets Bureau moved in to seize flashy cars, luxury watches, and even properties linked to the gang's drug profits. Detectives swept up remaining key members on outstanding warrants and charges. Informants were leaned on to give up info in exchange for protection. Slowly but surely, the once cocky Gucci gang was dismantled. Glenn Ward, already in custody awaiting trial, found himself slapped with additional charges, though prosecutors were content to focus on the rock-solid firearms case, rather than try to pin murders on him with reluctant witnesses. In April 2025, Glenn "Mr. Flashy" Ward stood before the Special Criminal Court to receive his sentence. Gone was the swaggering gang boss in designer gear. Facing the judges was a 32-year-old man in prison greens, visibly diminished by years of looking over his shoulder. The court heard how he had brazenly fired a high-powered rifle in a residential area, endangering countless lives. Video evidence left no room for doubt. The judge, noting the unreality of any claim that Glenn's involvement with the gun was minor, handed down a sentence of 5.5 years in prison. As the details of the case spilled out, the cache of ammunition, the video of Glenn egging on his younger brother to shoot, the media and public saw in stark detail the reckless bravado that had defined Mr. Flashy's reign. This prison term effectively marked the end of the Gucci gang's decade of mayhem. Glenn's remaining loyalists had either turned against him, been imprisoned, or fallen prey to the violence they helped unleash. Even the Kinahan cartel had reportedly cut him loose. With so much heat around Flashy, he was more liability than asset to them. In a bitter irony, Glenn Ward survived all those assassination attempts only to end up isolated and broke behind bars, living in protective custody because of threats to his life from fellow inmates. His power on the streets evaporated almost overnight. Younger, more cunning criminals stepped into the void he left, many of them former protégés of Flashy who had vowed never to make the mistakes their old boss did. Mr. Flashy, once the flashiest of them all, became yesterday's news. The story of the Gucci gang in Dublin is a tale of rise and fall as dramatic as any gangland saga. They emerged from obscurity with ferocity, a band of flashy, fearless youths who embraced designer decadence while waging deadly feuds over drugs and respect. They reveled in their notoriety, flaunting wealth and weaponry, convinced that they were a new breed of criminal untouchable by both rivals and law enforcement. For a while, it seemed true. Their enemies either ended up in graves or were too scared to challenge them, and the authorities struggled to build cases as the community cowered under the gang's reign of fear. But ultimately, their own excesses undid them. The same arrogance that made Glenn Ward strap on a Gucci belt and call himself King of Finglas also led him to record himself committing crimes and alienate his closest allies. The betrayals and bloodshed that he used as tools to maintain power only served to splinter his empire and rally many against him. By the time Mr. Flashy was led out of the courtroom to begin his prison sentence, he had become a cautionary figure. On the streets of Dublin, mothers point to his example when warning their sons about the false glamour of gang life. Yes, Glenn Ward had the Gucci, the glitz, and the Instagram moments of glory, but he also left a trail of devastation. Countless grieving families, communities scarred by violence, and friends turned foes who lost their lives far too young. As of today, the Gucci gang is effectively history. Its former leader sits in a cell, knowing that if and when he is released, a Dublin he no longer controls will be waiting. And possibly those old enemies too. In the neighborhoods he once terrorized, there is relief, but also the sobering understanding that someone new will eventually try to fill the vacuum. The cycle of gangland crime seldom stops. It only changes names and faces. Yet the rise and fall of the Gucci gang will be remembered. It's a stark reminder of how an insatiable appetite for flashy wealth and street prestige can drive seemingly ordinary young men to commit extraordinary acts of violence, and how, in the end, all that Gucci glamour can unravel into heartbreak and defeat. The story of Mr. Flashy and his gang is not just about crimes and killings. It's about the seduction of power and the price one pays when living by the gun. In Dublin's gangland lore, the Gucci gang's chapter stands as one of the most dramatic, a meteoric ascent into infamy followed by a spectacular crash back to reality, leaving behind nothing but cautionary tales on the cold streets of Finglas.